This is not a safe place. Sun-baked earth, parched and webbed with cracks, stretches for hundreds of miles in all directions. Interrupting the jagged stone plateaus, the hamadas are vast ergs, oceans of sand with dunes towering hundreds of feet high. Shade is rare and water rarer still, as hot and wicked winds whip sand and dust across the landscape, changing the face of the desert each and every day. Great monoliths of stone are the only constant here, but they too are temporary in the face of the relentless and fitful gusts which grind them down into the monotony which surrounds them. Living things struggle here, but dead things are another story. This is the Gerab Desert, a part of the Greater Sahara, and it stretches across much of the Central African nation of Chad. The Gerab is right at home in its severity. To the north, the spires of the Tibesti Mountains rake the belly of the sky, and to the east, the erg of Bilma's sea of dunes swell like waves to the horizon. The sun glares down on the maximum security Koro Toro prison erected in the east of the Gerab, and in the south, small settlements upheld by strong people pockmark the endless scorched stones. For an animal or plant to live in the Gerab is difficult, but this desert seems almost hostile to mere human presence itself. And yet it is here, in this harsh, forsaken place, that a skull was touched for the first time in 7 million years, placing a curse on an entire field of science. My gentle and of course very modern apes, today we're talking about one of the most controversial fossils in the study of human evolution, in all of paleoanthropology, and we're also going to talk a little bit about the people who it may have hexed. First things first, right off the bat, this video sources extensively from an article published by Scott Saiger in The Guardian called The Curse of Touma. You can find the link in the description. It's a phenomenal article that's going to go a little bit more in depth in some places than I'm going to go in this video, so please check it out. When this article sort of dropped, it was all over Paleo Twitter, Paleo Blue Sky, whatever you want to call it, and people that I know were talking about it a lot, in part because this is a story that a lot of us knew, at least in part. Any discipline in science is, in essence, a small world. Most people know most other people, especially if they publish a lot or are bigger names within that discipline. And a lot of this conversation tends to happen at yearly conferences, which happen all over the world and are attended by many of the same people. So I heard a version of this story in my undergraduate career when I picked up a minor in anthropology, during my master's degree in primatology, and of course I've been hearing versions of it over the past 4 years as a doctoral candidate in biological anthropology. And it's a very interesting story. This probably isn't very surprising, but I think it's like this in any discipline. It certainly is within paleoanthropology, but when there's big news on the horizon, by the time that big news drops and meets the public, there have usually been whispers and conversations about it in the discipline amongst the researchers within it for many years. I think it's fair to say that rarely are these whispers and murmurings the full story, which we usually have to wait for like everybody else unless it's sort of soft launched at a conference. But this new Guardian article did not come as a surprise to anybody that I know. At least in general, the details have been the talk of the town. I'll speak for myself, but when I saw the title, I was like, that's a little hyperbolic. And by the time I finished it, I was like, maybe Touma is cursed. That's quite sad to me because I think of Touma as a very cute and charming fossil. But I guess that just goes to show that looks can be deceiving. French paleontologist Michel Brunet had had a bad string of luck. Early in his career, he was routed by the Soviets while searching Afghanistan for early human relatives thanks to the hype surrounding Ramapithecus. The roughly 14 million year old Ramapithecus would turn out to be females of the species Shivapithecus, a close orangutan relative that was erroneously thought to be a hominin due to its small canine teeth. It was just a female of a dimorphic species. Cameroon was next, but a whole lot of nothing, and the death of a collaborator sent him packing from there too. Now you might be wondering, Michel, Dr. Brunet, why aren't you searching Eastern or South Africa? This is where all of the hominin fossils seem to be coming from, especially at this point in time. And the reason is pretty simple. Brunet was not interested in the period of time that was yielding the fossils of the now well-known members of genus Australopithecus. Australopithecus is the genus that the famous Lucy belongs to. Australopithecus afarensis is her species, and the genus name Australopithecus just means southern ape. This is a group of animals that are basically smack dab between earlier apish-looking apes of the Miocene and anatomically modern humans. They were upright walkers like us, but still had small brains. You see, at this point in time, the turn of the century, we understood pretty well how molecular clocks worked, and we knew that the last common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees lived sometime between 7 and 14 million years ago, with the confidence being around that 7 to 8 million year ago range. We've also understood for quite some time the characteristics that make modern humans, a species of great ape, different from other species of great apes, like chimpanzees, gorillas, or orangutans. We have itty-bitty canine teeth, we walk on 2 legs instead of knuckle walking or clambering through the trees, we grow up extremely slow, we have really big brains, and we occupy this really expansive niche. But here we have genus Australopithecus with small canines and already walking upright, meaning 2 of the 5 characteristics that make humans unique, at least today, were already around by this expansive and well-known genus's time, again around 4 million years ago, which means that the emergence of those 2 characteristics, the sweets that make something bipedal and the reduction of the canine, and I'll add the reduction of the dimorphism of those canines, or the sexes having the same sized canine teeth, that had to have come before, and it was those early hominins that Brunet was interested in, meaning he needed older localities. So perhaps it was a combination of the crowded nature, paleontology-wise, of Eastern and South Africa, as well as their lack of old enough fossil-bearing sites that sent him looking elsewhere for the first hominin. Now, a hominin is just anything on the human side of things after our split with chimpanzees, roughly, again, at the time, 7 to 14 million years ago. After years of fruitless searching, it would be in one of the most unexpected places, a hostile desert in Central Africa in the nation of Chad, that Brunet would finally hit pay dirt. Now, this is a tale as old as time in paleontology, the stories of disappointing failure that precede incredible discoveries like Tiktaalik or Ambulocetus or Homo naledi, months or years or decades of searching and turning up absolutely nothing before finally the discoverer in question meets with the big one. These aren't exaggerations, this is just the nature of the beast within paleontology. Major discoveries are the exception, not the norm. Interruptions to otherwise pretty monotonous strings of searching deserts or mountains or jungles, crawling around on your hands and knees with your fingers in the dirt, hoping to find a scrap of bone peeking from the crust of the earth. It's a miserable experience, but some freaks love it. The year is 2001, and 4 men, 3 Chadians and 1 French scientist, are walking across the Gerab Desert prospecting. Surprisingly, desert localities can produce a great many fossils if you can get the timing right. The fossils need to be exposed and found before the dunes swallow them back up, or they are eroded away into dust by the sandpaper-like wind known to the Gerab Desert. The men had set out from N'Djamena to the Taurus Manala region of the Gerab and found themselves picking along a rocky terrace of land called a scarp. There, the story goes, the Chadian Alhunta Jim Demalbe found fossils resting on the surface. One can picture the man, exhausted and scoured by wind and sun, approach the collection of bones gingerly, almost as if to not scare them off. He would have seen the skull, a cranium technically, simmering from its place amongst the remains. It may have looked evil, encrusted in the black mineral deposits, burning like an ember in the light of the sun it was now seeing for the first time in 7 million years. Sayer describes it as charred and slightly malevolent. Aw, poor Tomai. Part of this fossil's sinister aura no doubt comes from its preservation. The cranium is exceptionally warped. After burial, the bones were stretched, crushed and twisted by the shifting of the earth itself, molding it into the angry, misshapen fossil that glowered at Jim de Malbay that fateful day. The Chadian must have called to the Frenchman, who confirmed its importance as a major paleontological discovery. Why, this seems like the perfect end to the setup, right? This seems like the reward, the big discovery after years, if not decades, of searching by Michel Brunet. Just one problem. This Frenchman was not Michel Brunet. Nope, this Frenchman was a geographer named Alain Beauvillain, and while he was a part of Brunet's team, Brunet wasn't actually a part of the original group when Toumai was discovered. Now, this isn't uncommon in paleontology. The person who's leading the expedition, even if they're not present, does kind of technically get credit for discovering the fossil, even if, in addition, the person who actually first laid eyes on it gets credit for it as well. But you wouldn't know that Brunet wasn't there for the initial discovery from his writings on the subject and public speaking engagements, etc. In fact, a lot of the way that Brunet handles the discovery of Toumai and the interpretations of Toumai and the publicity surrounding Toumai is really going to irritate Beauvillain. And it doesn't help that, as Scott Sayer already pointed out, these guys were at odds before the discovery, and it's only going to get worse from here. In fact, everybody involved with Toumai, which is the name for this fossil, it means hope of life in the Daza language, seems to be inflicted with madness and obsession just by virtue of associating with it. It's like a movie in the sense that you can almost picture Beauvillain sitting all those decades ago as the sun set on the Gerab Desert, gazing into the deformed ancient sockets of Toumai as the curse of obsession for this thing starts to take root. And it wouldn't be long until it ended up in the hands of Michel Brunet as well. News quickly gets back to Brunet that they've discovered some kind of hominid fossil, to say the least. Certainly, there is a great ape cranium in the hands of Beauvillain and the Chadians, and this is obviously extremely interesting to Michel Brunet, because this is kind of a bombshell. Everyone involved in the project already knew that the sediments associated with Toumai are very old, much older than the hominins that are showing up in the form of Australopithecus, of Eastern Africa, and of South Africa. This thing is clearly some kind of hominid. It's some kind of great ape. There's no mistaking it. But if it happens to be a hominin, that is to say, a member on the human lineage, on the line after the split between humans and chimpanzees, headed in our general direction, that would make this not only the oldest hominin so far, but it's also not in Eastern or Southern Africa, where all of the other early hominins are showing up. Brunet hustled down to Chad, took one look at it, and bundled it up to take it back to France, where one sunny summer afternoon at the University of Poitiers, he pored over it with several colleagues. What to make of this strange hominid skull? Any paleontologist or paleoanthropologist or primatologist worth their salt can tell you immediately what is weird about this fossil. This thing was a strange mosaic of features, a mixture of primitive and modern. The brain case is small, low, and long, around the size of a modern-day chimpanzee, but a small one at that. Over the orbits, an enormous brow ridge hangs, giving the impression that we're looking at a male. Typically, males have more imposing brow ridges than females. It's considered a sexually dimorphic trait in most apes. The orbits themselves are attached to a face that's relatively flat compared to a chimpanzee. Chimps often act as our stand-in for Miocene apes, but in this case we have one to compare it to. Its face is flatter than the earlier Afropithecus, and you can probably notice something else that isn't as impressive in this Toumai fossil as compared to Afropithecus, and that's the canine teeth. That's obviously important that Sahelanthropus has these itty-bitty dwarfed canine teeth compared to earlier Miocene apes and compared to non-human living apes, because that's one of the characteristics that, as I said earlier, characterizes hominins, that makes humans as the last surviving hominin unique amongst the apes, amongst the hominids. But the real prize is when you flipped the cranium over. Preserved in the skull, although it is warped, is the foramen magnum, or the hole at the base of the skull where the spine actually exits. Now, the position and the angle of the foramen magnum can actually tell us a lot about how an organism holds its body. As humans, we walk bipedally or upright, so our head needs to sit on top of our vertebral column, and that's reflected in this anterior or forwardly placed and angled foramen magnum. If you take a pencil or a little stick and then flip the head up, you can see that it holds nicely the head on top of the vertebral column so our human can walk around. Compare that to something like a coyote, which are quadrupedal. They walk on all fours, so their spinal cord has to exit from the back. And there, the foramen magnum sits, and you can stick a pencil directly in. Just as one would expect, the foramen magnum's angle and position is posterior so that this coyote can hold its head sort of parallel to the ground as it moves around on 4 feet. Chimpanzees are quadrupeds, but they knuckle walk, so their foramen magnum is more anterior than something like a coyote, but it's still posterior compared to a human. You can check this by holding their palates level to one another, like so, and looking at where their foramen magnum is positioned and how it's angled. It's more forward in the human than it is in the chimp, and it's more forwardly angled in the human as compared to the chimp. So human evolution makes a really nice prediction. If the position and angle of the foramen magnum is related to bipedalism, we should see the human position and angle emerge slowly through geologic time in fossil hominins, in our ape men. And when we hold our palates relative of a human versus Sahelanthropus chidensis, what you can hopefully see is that that foramen magnum is more forwardly placed than it was in the chimpanzee. It's not all the way in the human position, but it's more forwardly placed and it's angled more forward. We can tell this because although it's warped and part of the foramen magnum is crushed so it doesn't hold that circular shape, the hole itself is more anterior, as are the landmarks around it, such as the occipital condyles. That's these little lumpy dudes right here and right here. For a chimpanzee, not only is the foramen magnum itself more posterior and angled more posteriorly, but those occipital condyles themselves are also more towards the back because they flank that foramen magnum. It's a really weird mix of characteristics for a hominin or hominid this old, and that is precisely the vibe that is reported to have been in the room in that lab at the University of Poitiers in 2001 as Michel Brunet showed his colleagues the strange touma cranium. In attendance is Roberto Macchiarelli. Roberto Macchiarelli is an Italian paleoanthropologist, and at the time he sat there in the lab as a colleague of Michel Brunet's, 15 years his junior and a professor there at Poitiers. According to Sayer's Guardian article with Macchiarelli and several others, Brunet was known as a very dominant personality there at Poitiers, and the impression that I got is that he also may have been a bit of a bully. Still, anyone could look at this thing and recognize that it was weird, and so Macchiarelli remarked to Brunet that that anterior foramen magnum may have suggested at the very least an upright posture for this thing, and potentially bipedal locomotion. Brunet concurred, and in fact, to him, it seemed like this was unambiguously the right answer, the correct interpretation of the fossil. There was no room for any alternative idea. This was the first biped, and that was what was reported in the Nature article the following year. A new hominid is born, Brunet declared. By virtue of his age, he is the ancestor of all Chadians, but also the ancestor of the whole of humankind. In the summer of 2002, the paper, A New Hominid from the Upper Miocene of Chad, Central Africa, was published in Nature. And it's a really fascinating paper that first and foremost finally gives this guy a species name, Sahelanthropus chadensis, or the Sahel man of Chad. The paper was pretty standard for this kind of discovery. Typically, when a new species or new genus is being reported on the basis of a specific fossil, it has to be described and diagnosed. You have to go through all of the characteristics of this new fossil and basically justify why it should be something new, why it shouldn't fall into an existing species or an existing genus. And so the purpose of this new paper was to report several different measurements and several different morphologic features that make Sahelanthropus chadensis, a unique species, a part of a brand new genus, that being Sahelanthropus. Now, obviously, the complete cranium, TM266, or Tauros manala 266, was the type specimen, or the representative of the species. This is the original single fossil that is sort of the justification of this new species. But the paper also reported several paratypes, or additional fossils that were part of the assemblage. It wasn't just one cranium, there were several other craniodental fossils that were assigned to the new species Sahelanthropus chilensis. The paper laments the fact that all of the fossils assigned to Sahelanthropus chilensis from Taurus Manala from this site were like craniodental, a part of the skull or a part of the dentition, and that there were no postcranial fossils. That's listed explicitly in the paper. Finally, it ends with the real bombshell, that this Sahelanthropus chilensis is the oldest hominid, and that was the word that at the time is now synonymous with hominin. So it's the oldest hominin, the oldest member of the human lineage after the human-chimpanzee split, and that thus our lineage did not begin in Eastern Africa or in South Africa, but in Central Africa. No one denied that TM266, Sahelanthropus chilensis tomai, was an important fossil and probably deserved to be a part of a new species, but not everybody was on board with this oldest hominin thing. Wolpoff, Sanu, Pickford, and Hawkes published Sahelanthropus or Sahelpithecus in 2002, just a few months after this initial Nature paper dropped. And that's like a pretty severe science burn, because what they're saying is Sahelanthropus, Sahel man of Chad, or Sahelpithecus, Sahel ape of Chad. They're basically questioning, is this really a hominin? Wolpoff and colleagues essentially go down the list on the Nature paper of all of the features that are used to argue that Sahelanthropus is a hominin, and they argue that each of those characteristics isn't quite what it seems to be. For example, the small canine, it's possible that we have another Ramapithecus situation, that actually Sahelanthropus is just a female. The big brow ridge, used to argue that it's a male and thus the canine is in fact reduced, well, that might be due not to its sex, but due to biomechanical loading. Female gorillas have pretty big brow ridges, and part of the reason is argued to be because these guys spent a whole lot of time chewing. Likewise, the flatter face may be the result of the same type of selection for biomechanics rather than what we see in later genus Homo. Finally, for the Basicranium and the foramen magnum, they argue that not all of the landmarks are hominin-like, and in fact, some of them seem to be more similar to chimpanzees and gorillas. A lot of the hominin-like characterization of their foramen magnum, Wolpoff and colleagues argue, is kind of unclear methodologically speaking from the Nature paper, so they can't really say conclusively that it looks more like a hominin than it does like other living apes. In addition, and this isn't really harped on excessively by Wolpoff and colleagues, but it's hard to really say with certainty on the basis of that original Nature paper that the foramen magnum really is super anterior, even relative to other landmarks on the Basicranium, because this thing is just beat to hell. Until a reconstruction comes out, it's kind of hard to say where it truly falls, at least using linear measurements in comparison to other hominins and other living apes. These might be good critiques. They seem at face value to at the very least be good questions. But part of the problem with this publication comes from the background of two of the authors, Martin Pickford and Bridget Sanu. I am very familiar with the works of Martin Pickford because he has done a whole lot in the period of time that I study, which is the early Miocene. But you might know Martin Pickford as well as Bridget Sanu from a different discovery. They were the discoverers of Auroran tuganensis, or Millennium Man, the hominin that, prior to Sahelanthropus chilensis, was the oldest hominin on record at 6 million years of age. And also Martin Pickford and Bridget Sanu are married. Not that it matters for the quality or content of their work, it's just worth noting. Now, interestingly enough, Auroran tuganensis is known not from a cranium, but from postcrania, right? The opposite of what was reported for Sahelanthropus chilensis. It's known from several femora, or a bunch of different thigh bones, if you will, and the proximal or upper portion of the thigh bone at that, which is the most important informative part, arguably, if you want to determine whether or not something was a biped. And it does look like Auroran tuganensis was bipedal at least some of the time. In addition, like Sahelanthropus chilensis, the canines of Auroran tuganensis appear to be smaller than other Miocene apes, and they're worn apically, or at the tip. And yet, across the comparable elements from Auroran and Sahelanthropus, it seems pretty clear, and it seems to be consensus that these things are two different species. Both of them are certainly hominids, and both of them are certainly old. What I'm trying to say is, at face value, Auroran tuganensis and Sahelanthropus chilensis are both really good candidates for what an early hominin should theoretically or could theoretically look like. But Sahelanthropus is older, so I think you can forgive some people for having a bit of skepticism on the Sahelanthropus or Sahelpithecus paper just because there's certainly motivations for Sanu and Pickford to not buy what Brunet is selling. So by the end of 2002, the field is already fractured. We've got the people who think that Sahelanthropus chilensis is the first hominin, and we've got the people who don't think that it's the first hominin, and that instead it's a different, but still important, Miocene ape that is not a part of the human lineage or the lineage leading towards humans. And on that side of things, we have two authors who are perhaps motivated in their reasoning since their hominin got usurped by Sahelanthropus chilensis, but we've also got two authors who have no motivated reasoning at all. And also, even if their reasoning is motivated, that doesn't mean they're wrong. Michel Brunet is unperturbed by this. He's confident that Sahelanthropus chilensis is the first hominin, haters notwithstanding, and so he's giving talks on Sahelanthropus chilensis. He's back in Chad, like helping film a documentary on its discovery.
Pratiquement, on a doublé la longueur de nos racines dans le temps.
He's confident, but Brunet's colleagues back at Poitiers are not particularly happy. Fame is clearly going to Brunet's head, and he won't hear any criticism of any of his moves or interpretations. Furthermore, the tendency of him to sort of belittle or condescend to collaborators who aren't grad students, they're collaborators, is getting worse. Another scientist at Poitiers, Olga Otero, noticed a paranoia seemed to be taking root in the mind of Michel Brunet regarding this fossil in particular. Sayer reports in an interview with Otero that Brunet seemed to treat studying toumai as if it were the most precious thing on Earth. Everyone seemed to want a slice of the toumai pie, to take the fossil that was rightfully Brunet's and potentially twist interpretations. Macchiarelli reports that Brunet wasn't exactly enthused to hear alternative opinions, especially if they had to do with his initial thoughts on Sahelanthropus chilensis. He was also, according to Sayer's interviews, treating graduate students like absolute garbage, not signing off on any research projects that didn't evidently benefit him specifically, considering them service providers and generally talking down to them. And graduate students were not the only ones getting the short end of the stick with Michel Brunet. Evidently, after the publication of Sahelanthropus chilensis in Nature, Beauvillain was recalled from Chad back to France, and he had his own obsession brewing. Remember, things had already soured between him and Brunet before the discovery of toumai, but now things were getting a little bit more intense. In 2004, while Brunet was down in Chad recording for the documentary, Beauvillain published in, as Sayer notes, increasingly obscure journals, thoughts and criticisms of the original publication in an attempt to undermine its significance. Some of the stuff that Beauvillain is getting up to in 2004 is incredibly petty. It's scientifically petty, but it is incredibly petty. Like, in this one, he publishes with a collaborator, and in their abstract, they're like, effectively, should we really be trusting this Sahelanthropus chilensis hubbub when the authors of that 2002 Nature paper, including, of course, Michel Brunet and colleagues, confused a left mandibular third molar for a right mandibular third molar? Wow, I hope someone got fired for that blunder. They also note that there was an incisor that was a part of the assemblage that wasn't included in the Discovery Nature paper in 2002. And it's like, I find all of that kind of weird because Beauvillain is an author on that Nature paper. So I'm kind of like, well, why didn't you say something then? Then the same journal publishes a correspondence where Brunet responds to Beauvillain, and then Beauvillain and his collaborator respond again to Brunet. And the title is like Sahelanthropus chilensis, the fact, and it's in Comic Sans, which was less criminal in 2004, to be fair. But kind of importantly, the arguments that they're having don't really have any bearing on the big question, which is Sahelanthropus chilensis the oldest hominin? Is it a hominin at all? While Brunet was in Chad and also fighting with Beauvillain, a much bigger controversy was stirring back home at Poitiers. Master student Aude Bergeret, promise I'm trying my best with these French names, was tasked with cutting open a few bones to extract the sediments inside. This isn't terribly uncommon in paleontology. If you have a question that requires destructive methods like cutting open a bone or grinding some of it off. Usually this is for things like getting additional information about the age of the fossil or determining something like life history. For the teeth, you typically are going to use the bones that either are unidentifiable because they're so poorly preserved or because they're heavily worn and battered. The trash bones. What I'm saying is that you use destructive methods on the trash bones. The age of Taurus Manala, the locality where Tomai, or Sahelanthropus chilensis, was found there in the Gerab Desert, had a range of dates. It was like roughly 6 to 7 million years of age. But to be fair, that does encompass the upper end of Aurora tugenensis. So in 2004, it's not surprising that the researchers wanted to find out with a little bit more clarity how old the site was. But remember, these bones are in the desert. A lot of them are sitting on the surface because they've already been eroded out of the stony matrix that they were locked in. So to get the age of them, you have to date the sediment that's trapped inside of them that hasn't eroded away. And to do that, you have to cut them open. Luckily, the site had produced tons of fossils that didn't belong to Sahelanthropus chilensis. So you had a bunch of shafts of long bones, which are typically the trash bones because it's very difficult to identify just the middle portion of a long bone. It doesn't have very many diagnostic features to it. Berger is sitting there with some bones that she's preparing to cut open to extract as much information as possible from them since they're kind of useless as they stand. But Bergeret is a responsible scientist. She wants to make sure that she has pictures of these things and measurements of these things before they're cut, because that is irreparable damage, even if they're trash bones. She's playing this safe. Bergeret pulls the next specimen slated to be cut, labeled undetermined long bone, and she's not sure what to make of it. When it comes to identifying specimens, sometimes you can be 95% sure that what you're looking at is unimportant, but there's a little itch in the back of your brain as you look at it and turn it over in your hands, and you think to yourself, I'm gonna go ahead and double check this before I do anything rash. But Bergeret's advisor is in Chad with Brunet, helping out with the documentary, looking for fossils, doing fieldwork stuff. So she does the next best thing, and she asks Macchiarelli for help. So people are really weird about fossils, and some of it is understandable, and some of it is definitely overkill. Where I did my work at the National Museums of Kenya, measuring Miocene ape teeth in the vault that contains the hominins, because the apes are just close enough to the hominins to be stored in the big bomb-proof vault instead of in the much easier to access sections of the museum. The specimens are stored in all of these large steel cabinets. And in most of the cabinets, there's published material that is like you're good to look at as long as you get permission from the museum and are properly affiliated and have done your due diligence there. But this is also where they store the unpublished specimens by several different researchers across several different countries. They're just in there, in the vault, in cabinets, that once you're in the vault are, for the most part, accessible. For this reason, you can't just sit in the vault unsupervised because bad actors might snoop at the unpublished material of other researchers and potentially scoop them. It's happened before. This has created a sort of undercurrent of paranoia amongst especially some of the older paleoanthropologists, because some of these guys were just like swiping each other's story with these fossils back in the day. So Michel Brunet is an older paleoanthropologist, and he's also gotten this reputation at Poitiers for being especially paranoid about Tomai and the site that surrounds it. Macchiarelli, I think, is appropriately tentative in helping Bergeret identify whatever this bone is because he doesn't have permission from Brunet to do so. And yet, here, he also has a graduate student who's feeling kind of lost at the task that they're supposed to perform, and he is a part of the university. He's a faculty member of the university. He could at least take a look. It's his duty. In an interview with Macchiarelli, Sayer recounts what happened next, and I'm going to read it to you because I think it's really well done. He saw immediately that Bergeret's long bone was the shaft of a left-hand femur. He took note of its robust diameter, its pronounced posterior ridge, its forward curvature. It was evident to Macchiarelli that it belonged to a primate. Odd. Where's this piece from? He asked, attempting to mask his mounting agitation. The femur's inventory number suggested it had been collected from the same site on the same day as the Sahelanthropus skull. The crucial postcrania that Brunet said did not exist evidently did. "Don't cut anything," he said to Bergeret. "This appears to be the femur of Tomai." He gave Bergeret some reference papers, told her to spend the weekend making a close study of the femur, and left. "I went back to my office," Macchiarelli said. "I closed the door, and I said to myself, shit." That's the worst possible thing that could have happened, because now they have to tell Brunet. Of course, the enormous bright side is that, holy crap, they might have postcrania for Sahelanthropus chilensis. Oh my god! Michel Brunet was not as enthused, and he retaliated against Bergeret with the full force of the university. First, she was called in and scolded in a private meeting. A laboratory meeting was held, and they reported to Pointillés that there had been this grave leak of scientific information. When Bergeret returned from some fieldwork, her research had been completely confiscated. The specimen had been quietly renumbered, and her advisor reportedly approached her with the femur in hand and said, "Forget you ever saw this." This is obviously overkill to the highest degree. I think anybody can see that. It's not like Bergeret was rifling through the cabinets she wasn't supposed to be touching. She was working with a fossil that she was told to prepare for analysis, to cut so that the sediment could be extracted. That was the task she was given. She wanted to make sure she wasn't about to cut something that was actually super important, and so she just double-checked. That's all she was trying to do, was double-check with somebody who was a little higher ranking than her at Pointillés, and for that, she was labeled a Judas. I don't know, I guess this stings especially to me because I could see myself doing this. Like, this is something that I would do. I could see myself sitting there, preparing some kind of specimen, looking at it and thinking, okay, I'm 95% sure this is nothing, but I just want to be positive. According to Sayer, it is made abundantly clear to Bergeret that she does not have a path to a doctorate there at Pointillés. So with Macchiarelli's help, she gets a gig elsewhere as a museum conservator, and she flies the coop. She moves on to greener pastures. Macchiarelli, on the other hand, is stuck at Pointillés. Like with Bergeret, Macchiarelli felt the tide turn against him at Pointillés from his collaborators due to his involvement in the femoral fiasco. And in addition, his brush with Tomai had led to an infection. He dreamed about it feverishly. "I didn't sleep for days," he told Sayer. "I replayed the film in my mind. I'd held it in my hands." There was an ape femur at Toros Manala, the shaft of an ape femur at the very least, and the only other ape at that site was Sahelanthropus chilensis, so it's certainly reasonable to propose that that femur may belong to Tomai. Macchiarelli knew this, Bergeret knew this, and now Brunet knew about it too. Because this had to be news to Brunet, right? He had been abundantly clear in previous papers that there was no postcrania associated with Sahelanthropus chilensis. It was just the craniodental stuff. He wouldn't be saying there was no postcrania if he was aware that there was a femur, right? That seems reasonable to me from Macchiarelli's perspective. But now he knew about it. It was a perfect opportunity to present it because Brunet was slated to release 2 articles, again in Nature, on new material found associated with Sahelanthropus chilensis and a stunning reconstruction of the cranium that would provide a lot more clarity as to the potentially anterior nature of that foramen magnum. Since this thing is so crushed and warped, a reconstruction is going to be helpful in figuring out the true location of this thing. But April 7th, 2005 only reported more craniodental specimens with regard to Sahelanthropus chilensis from Toros Manala. Nothing about that femur. The reconstruction paper pretty convincingly, in my opinion, supports the notion that the basicranium, or the bottom plane of this cranium, is more similar to Australopithecus than it is to other living apes like chimpanzees and presumably Miocene apes, supporting the idea that, at least with regard to this portion of the cranium, including the foramen magnum, Sahelanthropus does look more like a hominin. But okay, does that mean that Sahelanthropus is for sure a hominin? I would propose that the answer to that is no. It's strong support of it, but it doesn't necessarily close the case because the floor of the skull being hominin-like may not mean that Sahelanthropus is a hominin. It may mean that Sahelanthropus is holding its body like a hominin holds its body, which is to say, upright. Let me break this down a little bit again. Humans, as bipedal apes, have the configuration of our foramen magnum and our basicranium the way that it is because we are upright. That foramen magnum has to be forward so that our skull can sit on top of our vertebral column as we move around, meaning to be a bipedal ape, your basicranium has to look roughly like this. It can't look like a chimp's and suggest that you're an obligate biped, right? But can this configuration be associated with anything else? All bipeds have this configuration, roughly speaking, but does everything with this configuration move bipedally? That's the important question. Because if there are any examples that we can find of an animal that has a foramen magnum position and basicranium organization that is even a little bit more similar to humans than it is to other apes, but they're not obligate or even facultative bipeds, that would suggest to us that we can't use the configuration that we see in Sahelanthropus to suggest that it was bipedal. It may be indicative of something else. Like, it's worth asking the question, is the position of the foramen magnum and the configuration of the basicranium more related to bipedalism, like locomotor style, or is it related to locomotor style through posture as a proxy? What I mean by that is all of this telling us more about locomotion or posture, or is it telling us both? So we can ask the question using the comparative method. Are there any animals alive today with a posture similar to humans that don't move bipedally? And if there are, what does their basicranium and foramen magnum position look like? Well, we have an animal like that. Gibbons. Gibbons are not obligate terrestrial bipeds. They brachiate, so they move hand over hand through the trees. But because they're moving below the branches, they too have an upright or orthograde posture. Because if I flip this cranium over and the base of the skull and the foramen magnum looks a little bit like Sahelanthropus, then it suddenly becomes possible that Sahelanthropus is just like a below branch suspensory clamberer or a brachiator, like a big gibbon or a big orangutan perhaps, instead of necessarily a bipedal hominin. But as far as I can tell, in 2005, no one had made that comparison yet. There were plenty of foramen magnum, basicranium comparisons between humans and chimpanzees, but chimps are knuckle walkers. They don't have an upright or orthograde posture. Their posture is kind of slanted like that because their arms are longer than their legs are to facilitate their knuckle walking. But comparison to a chimpanzee doesn't preclude the potential explanation of Sahelanthropus's basicranium and foramen magnum through like similarity to gibbons or orangutans. And as far as I can tell, that hadn't been done yet, which makes what Brunet said about that newest paper a little bit premature. He said, now it's completely confirmed that Tomai is not a chimp or a gorilla, but a true hominin. Well, gee, Michel, I don't know about that. Another paper came out that year in December looking at the morphologic affinities of that cranium now that it was reconstructed. And just like in the reconstruction paper, it showed the closest association with members of Australopithecus. It may be tempting to say, well, that cinches it, right? If it's the most similar to Australopithecus, then we can safely say that given Australopithecus is definitely bipedal when it's on the ground, Sahelanthropus was as well. But I think that's jumping the gun. Part of the reason why we know Australopithecus is for sure bipedal on the ground is because we have so many specimens, so many partial individuals, so many isolated bones that continue to confirm the bipedal nature of this thing, from the valgus knee to the shape of the spine to the inline big toe to the bowl-shaped pelvis to the arches in the feet. It is a smorgasbord of like bipedal characteristics. There is absolutely no misinterpreting it. Now, Australopithecus also has an anterior foramen magnum and a basicranium that looks more like a human than it does like a chimpanzee, just like Sahelanthropus, but Sahelanthropus doesn't have the benefit of having all of those other characteristics to assess. And again, it could be that that basicranium and foramen magnum are telling us about the posture of the animal. And Australopithecus is also orthograde, just like humans are orthograde, just like gibbons are orthograde. And the abstract states that most particularly it is the basicranium that is similar between Sahelanthropus and Australopithecus. That Sahelanthropus has all of these other primitive characteristics, but the basicranium specifically looks really modern. And it's like, okay, that works if that basic cranium is only associated with hominins. If it's not, then a lot of what makes Sahelanthropus a hominin goes away. Not all of what makes it a hominin, just a lot of it. And obviously no gibbons and no orangutans for that matter were included in that analysis, just gorillas and chimps and a lot of hominins. So what I'm saying is that hesitation, I think, was warranted. I think it would have been fine to say, yeah, it looks like it's probably a hominin, but I think that Brunet was coming at this with a lot more confidence than perhaps he should have. What we needed was two separate things. One, a comparison of the basic cranium and foramen magnum of a bunch of different hominoids and probably some outgroup mammals as well to confirm that the hominin condition is in fact unique and can diagnose an orthograde biped. And two, we needed postcrania. And one of those we already had. While Brunet is publishing and giving talks on the definitive hominin nature of toumai of Sahelanthropus chilensis, including talking about how there's no postcrania, Macchiarelli is stewing. He's not the only one, but toumai burns like the sands of the gerab in the back of Macchiarelli's mind. Between 2005 and 2009, the curse festers, prompting Macchiarelli to reach out to several organizations, including the University of Poitiers itself, and formally accuse Brunet of hiding the femur. There has been a selection, a choosing of which remains to publish and which not. Macchiarelli told Sayer, no one has the right to do that. I can't even imagine the frustration for Macchiarelli here, and probably Bergeret as well, because they have the pictures of this thing. They have the pictures and the measurements, and they can't do anything about it because you can't publish on a fossil that isn't yours. Luckily, someone is about to take care of that problem. In Was Toumai Buried, Beauvalin suggests that perhaps the Sahelanthropus chadensis remains had been exposed to humans like decades or even hundreds of years prior to their secondary discovery by paleontologists. He argues that the bones had been found by humans, reburied, and oriented to face Mecca. That is not what made this publication interesting, though. What made the publication interesting were several photographs taken evidently at discovery of toumai of Sahelanthropus chilensis. And in the primary photograph, clear as day, there is a femur. Now there's public confirmation that the femur exists. Granted, it was published in like a regional French journal, but public is public, and it is now out there. Macchiarelli has seen it, so has everyone else. And actually, I'll correct myself, Sayer notes that it wasn't a French regional geological or geographical journal, but a newsletter. But publishing a photo that has the femur in it is not the same thing in paleontology as formally examining, analyzing, and diagnosing a specimen. That needed to happen. And Macchiarelli, along with Bergeret, had photos that were high enough quality, perhaps, to do so. Now, I can't stress what a big deal it is to scoop someone else's fossil, even under circumstances like this. And Macchiarelli and Bergeret knew this, and so they thought to take a different approach, an approach that might prompt Brunet and colleagues to publish officially on the femur with a real description. They went to John Hawkes. Now, John Hawkes is a paleoanthropologist and also an enormously successful blogger of paleoanthropological news. He makes it digestible to the public, and he is quite good at it. You might also remember John Hawkes from the Sahelanthropus or Sahelpithecus paper. Yes, he is, as Sayer puts it, a long-time Sahelanthropus skeptic. Those of you familiar with paleoanthropology will perhaps appreciate the irony of John Hawkes being skeptical of Sahelanthropus. In less than a decade, he himself would face immense skepticism from the rest of the paleoanthropological community due to his position on Homo naledi, but that's a story for another time. And so Hawkes reports on the femur on his blog, asking the question on everybody's mind, where is this femur now and why has no one formally described it? For Brunet's part, the Beauvalin stuff, the coverage of the Beauvalin stuff, and the John Hawkes blog post pissed him off, and his response was basically just like, we're working on it. Like, yeah, there might be hominoid bones there that could even perhaps be associated with toumai is the implication, but he's only willing to comment on stuff that has been published. But then everybody's like, well, why hasn't this been published? It's a femur. That should be like priority number 1, perhaps, or I guess priority number 2 after the cranium, but still really important. And now, of course, everybody's wondering, and particularly Macchiarelli is wondering, did Brunet know about the femur? In his interview with Sayer, Macchiarelli describes how his opinion shifted from initially thinking that Brunet didn't know about the femur at first, and that's why he had never published on it, because he was embarrassed that he had missed such a monumental bone amongst the assemblage. But his opinion slowly turned into thinking that perhaps Brunet had known about it all along and was intentionally not publishing on it because it didn't, quote, fit. Because remember, there are a lot of characteristics, morphologically or physically speaking, that denote a biped in the fossil record. We have a lot of parts of our anatomy that allow us to be efficient bipeds, and we see the emergence of those characteristics in the hominin fossil record. Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, has all of the characteristics needed to be an efficient biped. Yes, she has that foramen magnum tucked up underneath the skull, but she's also got the S-shaped spine and the bowl-shaped pelvis with sagittally oriented ilia to anchor those powerful gluteal muscles. She's got an inline big toe to help toe off as she moves and 3 arches in the foot to absorb shock. And she has a valgus knee. That means the femur comes in sort of at an angle, and it's quite straight in Lucy's species. What I'm trying to say is there are aspects of the anatomy outside of the base of the cranium that can tell us whether or not something was bipedal. If you have a lot of those characteristics in one animal, you can be pretty confident you're looking at a biped. At least at present, the foramen magnum's position and orientation, as well as the basicranium as a whole, was still a little bit potentially ambiguous in definitively denoting a biped. But here we have 2 characteristics, not just the basicranium with the foramen magnum, but also a femur. This could potentially add confidence or reduce confidence on Sahelanthropus's locomotor style. So you can kind of see where Macchiarelli is coming from in thinking that Brunet now knows about the femur, or he knew about it all along, one or the other, but he certainly knows about it now, and yet he hasn't published on it. And it contains a signal that may support or reduce the notion that Sahelanthropus chilensis was a biped or a hominin at all. He's not publishing on it because it's not helping his case, is the thinking from Macchiarelli's perspective. So what's Michel Brunet think about all this? Well, Brunet is pissed. He's pissed off about the blog post. He's pissed off at Bergeret and Macchiarelli, and he is so unbelievably angry at Beauvillain. In fact, initially, according to Scott Sayer, Brunet wouldn't agree to do an interview with him unless Sayer agreed not to talk to Beauvillain ever. Scott was like, who are you talking about? Because apparently Brunet wouldn't say Beauvillain's name. It was he who shall not be named. So Sayer wasn't even sure who Brunet meant. But once it was clear, Scott was like, no, I'm not going to agree to that. And then Brunet was like, okay, I'll do the interview anyways. Sayer also interviewed Franck Guy, who's a paleoanthropologist at Poitiers as well, and who knows everybody involved. Guy has always been really sympathetic towards the idea that Sahelanthropus chilensis is in fact a hominin and is probably bipedal, so it means quite a bit that in an interview with Sayer, Guy talked quite a bit about how angry Brunet was in 2009. Brunet did not want to publish on this femur. Evidently, he was going to conferences and getting angry on stage about how people expected him to publish on this postcranium, that it was coming, he would get around to it, but you get this feeling like he felt pressured to publish on something that he was not ready to talk about just yet. Guy also talks a lot about how evidently Brunet's behavior as this sort of domineering personality was continuing to rise. It was reaching a fever pitch to the extent that 2 full studies on the geochemistry and on the brain case of Sahelanthropus had virtually reached completion, and none of them contradicted any of the ideas that Brunet had about Sahelanthropus chilensis, but they were never published because Brunet was having all of these disputes with the co-authors. Guy's perspective in Sayer's article is really fascinating because he was put in this bizarre position. On one hand, he agreed with Brunet that what Macchiarelli had done was not ethically appropriate with regard to the standards of the field. You can't just go around taking pictures that you took without permission and publishing them in blogs. He was not happy with that. And yet at the same time, Guy agreed with Macchiarelli that this femur needed to be published on, right? It needed to be written up. And the fact that Brunet was dragging his feet was making Pointier's look really bad, and it was also ethically dubious. So, as Guy continued to rise in the ranks at Pointier's, he and a colleague began to put pressure on Brunet to publish. As an outside observer reading Sayer's article, the interactions between all of these people are really interesting and very dramatic. Macchiarelli is continuing to send emails to Pointier's, to the leadership, to Brunet's former disciples, people like Guy, and he's like, publish the femur, you need to publish the femur. Meanwhile, Guy and colleagues are feeling like they're essentially getting harassed for something that they don't really have any control over. Because Brunet is just not hearing it, right? Like, he does not care about Macchiarelli. He doesn't care about his colleagues at Pointier's with regard to the femur. He's sort of like, I'll get to it when I get to it. From 2004 to 2018, Macchiarelli is thinking about the femur like basically every day, according to his interview with Sayer. The curse of touma is active. It has taken control of the mind of Macchiarelli and of Beauvillain and of Brunet, and it's starting to take hold of Guy as well and other researchers at Pointier's. Macchiarelli finally just decides, you know what, screw it. I am going to formally describe this femur at a conference. He submits an abstract, right? As I said earlier, you can usually soft launch ideas at conferences and get some feedback. It's sort of like a lower level of presenting an idea as compared to fully writing it up and publishing it. So this is sort of another smaller step that Macchiarelli is taking. He submits his abstract, and it's rejected. It is extremely rare for an abstract to get rejected at a conference, right? Like, this is supposed to be an open floor to discuss all sorts of ideas. So the barrier to entry is pretty low. Apparently, the committee that rejected it insisted that the reasons it was rejected were like run-of-the-mill methodological reasons. And I don't know anything about how this works in France, but I can tell you how it works in the United States. It is difficult to get an abstract rejected. And knowing about Macchiarelli's past work, seeing his body of literature, I seriously doubt that it was rejected because it was a bad abstract. Instead, I kind of believe that the folks who rejected it knew what a stir it would cause. The non-Brunet researchers at Pointier's were kind of humiliated by the coverage of this whole thing. Like, Nature talked about how Sahelanthropus chilensis was the only thing anybody was talking about, but that there were no formal sessions on it. And so the administration at Pointier's wanted things settled. Macchiarelli and the non-Brunet researchers, like Guy and colleagues, finally seemed to reach an agreement. The non-Brunet researchers would publish, with Brunet's permission, on the femur, but Macchiarelli had to quit talking about it. He had to quit blasting them to the press on this subject. As far as I can understand, that agreement was struck in like 2018, 2019, and in 2020, Macchiarelli just published on the femur in the JHE. He was sick of waiting, and so he broke the agreement. He and Bergeret, along with two other authors, including Bernard Wood, published Nature and Relationships of Sahelanthropus chilensis, which included a formal description of the femur as well as some comparative morphology that, shocker, seemed to suggest the femur didn't belong to a biped. And if that femur was Sahelanthropus chilensis' femur, it seemed to suggest that Sahelanthropus chilensis wasn't exactly what it was being pitched as all those years. So a couple of things. First and foremost, this is the shaft of a femur. It doesn't preserve the ends or the epiphyses of the bone. And the epiphyses, the proximal and distal ends of the bone, those are way more informative than the middle section, which is a lot more mundane. It doesn't preserve a lot of the details, and so it can't be used as highly, as confidently to say anything about the animal unless it preserves some important muscle attachment sites. Another thing we have to consider is types of bipedalism. Humans are obligately bipedal. That means we are obligated to walk upright. We couldn't walk quadrupedally without developing pathologies if we wanted to. Our bodies are built for upright walking. We have to do it. Chimpanzees are knuckle walkers. They are obligate quadrupeds. If they spend their entire lives walking nothing but upright, bipedally, they develop pathologies. They can do it for short bursts, but circus chimpanzees develop a lot of issues if all they do is walk upright all the time. But in between those two states, there are a lot of intermediates, and the definitions can get kind of wonky because different people sometimes use them in different ways. Facultative bipedalism describes an animal that is capable of walking upright when it needs to, but doesn't do so very often. So in a way, this could describe chimpanzees, but it's not often used to describe them because they walk bipedally so little of the time. And then there's habitual bipedalism, which is an animal that spends quite a bit of time walking upright, but not all of its time walking upright. And habitual bipedalism is going to describe some of these earliest hominins. And then there's an additional problem, which is substrate, right? So Australopithecus as a genus might be a facultative biped in the sense that it spends some of its time on the ground where it is bipedal, and it spends some of its time in the trees where it's upright but not walking as it would on the ground. There's a lot of like moving around and clambering. But if we're only considering when it's on the ground, it's an obligate biped in that sense. So you have to consider the type of bipedalism couched within the behavior generally and in subsets of the behavior too. It's annoying and complicated, so I'm going to simplify it like this. We're going to ask the question, how does an animal move generally on the ground or in the trees? And when it's on the ground, how is it moving then? Bipedally or some other means, as a general quadruped, as a knuckle-walking quadruped, as a vertical clinger and leaper, whatever. Humans are mostly terrestrial as opposed to arboreal. We spend most of our time on the ground. And when we are on the ground, we're obligate bipeds. We have to walk upright. Australopithecus as a genus is sometimes terrestrial and sometimes arboreal. When it's in the trees, it's probably clambering around, not dissimilar to how an orangutan does, but when it comes to the ground, its anatomy necessitates that it is an obligate biped just like a human would be. What was Sahelanthropus chilensis? I'm clarifying this now because as we look at this current paper, Macchiarelli et al. 2020, and also back at all of those previous papers, it becomes abundantly clear that part of the reason why we can't agree on an answer is because we're not all asking the same question. The first Nature paper by Brunet and colleagues says Sahelanthropus chilensis is a biped, but when you go into the paper itself, they're clear that they mean a habitual biped. The response paper by Wolpoff and colleagues, Sahelanthropus or Sahelanthropithecus, distinctly makes the case that Sahelanthropus chilensis is not an obligate biped. But who was saying that it was? Like maybe Brunet was saying that it was in like talks or presentations. I don't know. I wasn't there. I was like a baby at that time. But certainly in the paper, it doesn't look like that 2002 Sahelanthropus Nature paper was saying that this thing was bipedal in the sense that humans are, or even really in the sense that Australopithecus was. The Zollicoffer cranial reconstruction paper in 2005 recapitulates what was said in the 2001 paper, arguing that Sahelanthropus was bipedal, but it doesn't say it was an obligate biped. This one doesn't specify that it was habitual, but it's sort of just saying bipedalism might have been present in Sahelanthropus. Then, the second paper that came out that year, looking at morphological affinities of Sahelanthropus chilensis, specifically says that Sahelanthropus was some kind of biped. All of this is being based on that foramen magnum position and basicranium morphology, and in between like 2010 and let's say 2020, we got a whole lot of debate within the scientific community as to how well foramen magnum position and the basicranium can actually delineate locomotion and posture, and hylobatids were included, or gibbons were actually included this time. That is a story for another time as well, but what I will tell you is that the consensus at present seems to be that basicranium and foramen magnum position can effectively delineate bipedalism in obligate bipeds and facultative bipeds from everybody else, and that the basicranium of gibbons, while in some ways does look kind of familiar, it does look more like a human in some ways as compared to like a chimpanzee, for example, taken as a whole, you can distinguish a brachiator like a gibbon with its orthograde posture from obligate or facultative bipeds. One of those papers that Brunet was an author on found that Sahelanthropus and also Ardipithecus mapped with the orthograde bipedal hominins as compared to the orthograde brachiating gibbons. There was a lot of debate after that, but I will sort of tie this up for now and say that in 2020, the most recent and arguably most comprehensive look at the entire basicranium and the foramen magnum specifically, not as Brunet had done, including other cranial measurements, found that although there is no one measurement that can distinguish between all locomotor or positional categories, you can actually use some of the measurements to specifically distinguish obligate and facultative bipeds from everybody else, which is really what we're worried about with hominin evolution specifically. That's quite nice to hear. Likewise, some measurements could distinguish between orthogrady and pronogrady. So this is really nice. This means that the basic cranium and the foramen magnum, for what we're concerned with hominin evolution, are in actuality informative. The location of the foramen magnum and its angle, as well as the surrounding structure it's couched within, can tell us a little bit about how a critter moved. However, Sahelanthropus chilensis was not included in that analysis, so we don't know where it falls in the most up-to-date, comprehensive look-see at this area. So at present, with regard to the base of the skull and the hole at the base of the skull, I think we can say that if the reconstruction of Sahelanthropus chilensis is correct, it is distinct from other orthograde non-bipeds like gibbons, which is good because that sort of throws this guy more in the direction of being some kind of hominin with some kind of bipedal capabilities, at least with regard to this area. The femur is a completely different story because Macchiarelli et al. Reported in 2020, the same year as that foramen magnum paper, that Sahelanthropus chilensis' femur is indicative of an animal that is not even habitually bipedal. Now, a lot of Macchiarelli's work was based off of brute linear measurements and pictures, and that's not generally best practice now because we have like geometric morphometrics and a whole lot of different lovely tools to actually compare the shapes of different bones. In fact, Macchiarelli described the paper as kind of mediocre to Sayer, but it was just time to get something out about the femur. One of the most compelling points that this paper makes that Sahelanthropus is not habitually bipedal is the simple photo of that femur, like from a sagittal view, looking at it from the side, where it's compared to an animal that we know was bipedal, Auroran tugenensis, whose femur looks a whole lot more like Homo sapiens, and you can see that Sahelanthropus' femur curves. It bends anteroposteriorly, just like a chimp's or a gorilla's. Likewise, in cross-section, looking at where the femur ends and looking at the cortical bone distribution, just by eyeballing it, it appears to look most similar to chimpanzees, although my layman's glance makes it seem like it's kind of in between humans and chimps, but certainly more similar to chimps. Macchiarelli was going scorched earth, not just with his proclamation that this femur was clearly not indicative of something that was habitually bipedal, but the circumstances surrounding its publication in the Journal of Human Evolution, or the JHE, are a little bit surprising. Evidently, Macchiarelli was aware that Guy and colleagues at Pointillés had a preprint out and ready to publish. Like it was in review to be published on this femur, just like he had always wanted, but he pressed on with the publication of his own article in the JHE all the same. It seems like he had just finally had enough, that he was just done with waiting on the publication of this femur, and he was like, screw it, I'll do it myself. And then when Pointillés got on the good foot and were like, no, we really are releasing it this time, Macchiarelli was like, too little, too late. Apparently, the French research organization sent a letter to the JHE, and they were like, this is probably violating some ethical rules, the fact that Macchiarelli has written like this formal description of the femur, and the JHE was like, we don't care. So you're probably wondering, like, what in the hell is Brunet saying about all this? Because Brunet, like, has opinions. He's never been shy on sharing them. Unfortunately, Sayer actually interviewed Brunet, as I alluded to earlier, for this Guardian piece. And when asked about the femur, when asked why he had kept it hidden for so long, Brunet was like, well, I wasn't really keeping it hidden. In fact, I actually knew about it the entire time. Sayer writes, he did falsely deny its existence, including in print, but contrary to Macchiarelli's assumption, this had nothing to do with what it showed about Sahelanthropus. He said, in Brunet's opinion, the femur obviously belonged to a bipedal hominin, but bipedalism in Sahelanthropus was already clear from the skull. Quote, it only confirmed what you could prove without it, unquote, he told Sayer. He had attempted to keep the femur out of the public eye because it was a quite damaged, difficult specimen, and he assumed, wrongly as it happened, that he would soon find other femora and that these would make for a more conclusive publication. Quote, I was too optimistic, unquote, he said. So I think it's pretty clear what happened. This is speculation on my part. I think Brunet saw the femur, saw that it had a relatively contradictory signal to what we were seeing from the cranium, and thought that maybe that was due to distortion or due to damage or whatever, and that finding more femora would clear things up, so best not to just throw a lot of confusion into the ring and allow the cranium to speak on its own until more femora could be found. And then we could talk about how those femora support the bipedal interpretation of Sahelanthropus. But to me, that as an excuse only works up until the point when you realize that you aren't finding any more femora and you need to do an analysis on the femur that you have. And to be quite honest, I still think that femur should have been published and analyzed right off the bat. Brunet seems nonchalant about it, though, in his conversation with Sayer, and he notes at one point in the conversation that he, had this conversation about the femur with other paleoanthropologists, he showed it to other people. I guess that's meant to demonstrate that it's not like he was trying to hide it or keep it under wraps because he was willing to talk to others about it. Apparently it was Lovejoy, Pilbeam, White, and Wood, and Brunet told Sayer to just ask them about the conversation. Sayer says, "When I did, 3 of the men said they had no recollection of seeing a femur at the time in question, though 2 did recall seeing one a few years later. One man, noting that he was a close friend of Brunet, declined to comment." That's all kind of weird, but as Sayer points out, if Brunet knew about the femur and appreciated its importance from the very beginning, why in the hell did he have it set to be cut in half? Sayer interviewed Beauvillain, who said that he showed Brunet the femur right off the bat, so he was aware of it from the very beginning. That sort of gives the impression that Brunet knew about the femur and was trying to hide it because it was giving some inconvenient phylogenetic signals, but then Jean-Renaud Boisserie, who's a colleague of Guy's and a co-author with him here in a moment, said that when he knew Brunet back when Tomai was first sort of coming to the surface and all of the big publications were happening, that Brunet was just completely consumed by the cranium, that he was totally one-track mind, and that sort of gives the impression that even if Brunet did know about the femur, maybe he just completely wrote it off. Meaning maybe there was nothing malicious about not talking about the femur, maybe he just knew about it and really just kind of paid it no heed because the cranium was so marvelous in comparison. But that all only works up to a point, right? At the very least by 2009, that femur should have been published on. It should have been formally described. And I think that because it wasn't, it certainly makes one think that there was something more going on with Brunet. I can't say the reason why Brunet didn't publish on the femur. It could have been malice, it could have been obstinance, it could have been ignorance, it could have been madness and obsession, it could have been some fifth reasonable thing that I can't currently divine. I can't read Brunet's mind. At the same time, why did Macchiarelli go ahead and push forward with the sort of illicit femoral publication in 2020 once he found out that Guy and colleagues had something in preprint? There's a hint of madness there as well. Of course, you could say that in that case it's justified because Macchiarelli had been pestering for years and years and years to get this thing out there, on one hand because that's scientifically ethical. But I think we would be naive to propose that there wasn't a personal aspect there too. Well, okay, so is Sahelanthropus chilensis bipedal? Is it a hominin? The basicranium and the foramen magnum hint that yes, it is bipedal, and yeah, it might be a hominin, but the femur seems to suggest that no, it probably wasn't bipedal, and no, it's not a hominin. So what did Guy and colleagues have to say? Because they had their paper in preprint, it did eventually come out in 2022. What's their take? Well, it's titled Postcranial Evidence of Late Miocene Hominin Bipedalism in Chad. It was published in Nature. So you tell me. What's that in the abstract there? Here we present postcranial evidence of the locomotor behavior of Sahelanthropus chilensis, with new insights into bipedalism at the early stage of hominin evolutionary history. The original material was discovered at locality TM266 of the Taurus Manala fossiliferous area and consists of 1 left femur and 2 right and left ulnae. They had the forearms too! What else do you have, Tomai? What else are you hiding? This paper by Dever, Guy, Boisserie, and several other individuals looks at the femur, the ulnae, and takes that into account with the cranium to assess Sahelanthropus chilensis overall. Interestingly, in an in-depth look at the femur, which to be fair was more comprehensive than what Macchiarelli did just because they had access to the bone itself, they came to the conclusion that while yes, it is very curved and looks more like a chimp or a gorilla in that sense, in most of the other characteristics, including the cortical bone distribution, this thing looks hominin-esque. But they also note that the ulnae, the plural of ulna, so the two forearm bones, those look like they belonged to an arboreal clamor, something that's spending a whole lot of time in the trees, climbing around. They look like orangutan forearms. They take those two features and combine them with what we had already known about the basic cranium, the foramen magnum, suggesting an upright posture and potentially bipedal locomotion for Sahelanthropus chilensis, and say this thing was probably a habitual biped. It was probably moving upright when it came to the ground, but still spending a whole lot of time in the trees, probably substantially more than the Australopiths that would come later. It's worth noting that after that paper came out, there was another paper by some Brazilian paleoanthropologists who proposed that looking at the cranium alone suggested that Sahelanthropus chilensis absolutely maps with the hominins as compared to other hominids or great apes, and we got some additional work from Guy and colleagues on the ulna and on the femur again, diving a little bit deeper. I'm sure I'm missing some, but the point is conversation is ongoing. The true nature of Sahelanthropus chilensis is also a bit of a story for another time though, because I'd like to dig into those a little deeper. We're concerned with the curse of Tomai. So what did Macchiarelli think of Dever and colleagues' paper? He called it a fairy tale, according to Sayer. And when Sayer asked about the methodology or the fact that it was published in Nature, he said, "Please be serious," and alleged that when it came to Sahelanthropus, Nature the journal could not be trusted. Macchiarelli and some other paleoanthropologists published a response to Dever in the JHE. These guys did not find Dever and colleagues' arguments with regard to the femur specifically compelling. They found that the characteristics that were used to argue that the femur belonged to a habitual biped aren't strictly found in habitual bipeds and thus can't be used to discriminate a specimen as belonging to one. So who is right with regard to the femur? The cranium seems to suggest that we've got an upright animal that is perhaps bipedal a little bit. In the arms, we have something that's definitely still spending some time in the trees. And with regard to the femur, we have multiple different paleoanthropologists, all of whom are qualified, all of whom are utilizing good methods, coming to different conclusions. Sayer rightly points out that fossils promise untold knowledge. Fossils promise worldly fame. Often they withhold both, sometimes they drive people mad. They do stir up an irrational element, Macchiarelli acknowledged, but as a responsible scientist adding careful bricks to the great edifice of learned wisdom, he said that he had never been swayed by such human passions. "I'm not on a crusade," he told Sayer in response to Sahelanthropus. "I simply think that the femur is not at all compatible with bipedality." Brunet prefers to ascribe Macchiarelli's 2-decade preoccupation with the femur to jealousy. And jealousy, Brunet is fond of saying, is a disease with no cure. "Impossible," Macchiarelli retorted, "for inexplicable reasons. Jealousy is not part of his psychological repertoire. The Tomai fossils seem to cause a certain derangement." Brunet went on, "Everyone who's come near Tomai, who's touched it, it's gone to their head. Like his antagonist, he seemed to imagine himself exempt." I love the way that Sayer has started to sort of wind this article down because he's completely right. I think he sums up the parties involved most intimately in a nutshell here. Brunet and Macchiarelli both see themselves justified, and I think they both are to varying degrees. I should say with regard to Sahelanthropus, there is never any excuse to be abusive towards graduate students or colleagues. Sayer's article, The Curse of Tomai, perhaps isn't about a fossil that curses all who work with it, but a story of human nature. It's kind of a story of how our pursuit of scientific discovery and inquiry can inadvertently become a pursuit of our own personal validation and glory. In doing so, by taking such strong and rigid stances about things like fossils, we place a curse on them. We make them infamous. Tomai didn't drive these researchers to insanity and obsession. People are by our nature insane and obsessive. We can all fall victim to our own ambitions if we're not careful. The Tomai cranium is the remains of someone who lived long ago. Its ancient, empty sockets gaze back with what feels like a quiet anticipation. Who is this fossil to us? The answer may lie in the lab yet, or it may slumber beneath the restless sands of the gerab. This creature has waited millions of years to see the light of day. What's a few more? Since this is my channel and I can say whatever I want, I'm going to give you my take on what I think Sahelanthropus chilensis is. I think it's an early hominin, or at least extremely similar to what we would expect from an early hominin, and here's why. I study canine teeth, and specifically I studied the sexual dimorphism of canine teeth in Miocene apes, so in the time period that Sahelanthropus is. What's interesting about canine teeth is that in both sexes across all apes, they're pretty big. In sexually dimorphic species, they're obviously bigger in males than they are in females, but they're still large for their body size for both sexes compared to humans, who have incredibly dwarfed itty-bitty teeny tiny canine teeth. In addition to this, males and females both have what's called a canine P3 honing complex. The canine P3 honing complex is how primates keep their canines sharp so that they don't dull over time and so that they can use them for things like display and beating the crap out of each other. And the way that this works is that the distal or sort of behind portion of this upper canine scrapes against this elongate P3 there on the bottom. So when the animal opens and closes its mouth, the back portion of that canine is honed on the front portion of that third premolar. Likewise, the canines in the mandibular and in the maxillary position hone each other on the front too. And this creates a mesial groove in the front portion of this macaque. It kind of looks like a little divot. And so when you actually take these things in cross-section, it gives them a heart shape, which is cute. Now in apes, this P3 honing complex is a lot less impressive. The shelf of that P3 isn't as elongate as it is in something like a rhesus macaque, and this gets even more extreme when you look at animals like mandrills. Like, just look at this thing. Look at the size of that shelf of that P3. And that makes sense, because this male mandrill needs to keep his canine super sharp so that he can actually compete for access to females. But females also have an elongate P3. Mandrills are the most sexually dimorphic primate in body size and in canine tooth size, obviously. But that elongate P3 is still present in the female, meaning if there isn't a canine P3 honing complex, that's not telling you that you're looking at a female. It's telling you that you might be looking at a hominin, because hominins are the first ones to lose it. You can tell if the canine P3 honing complex is on the way out or gone if the canines wear apically or at the tip of the tooth, because there's nothing to keep them sharp. In Ardipithecus ramidus, that honing complex is essentially gone, but in its predecessor, Ardipithecus cadaba, it's there, but partially. One thing that's shared by Sahelanthropus chilensis and by Aurora tugenensis and by both species of Ardipithecus and every hominin after them is a reduction in canine teeth, wear at the tip of the canine tooth, a loss of the canine P3 complex, and a loss in the dimorphism of those canines. Keeping with Macchiarelli and colleagues' bequest to keep the characteristics that define a hominin to ones that are found exclusively in hominins, that's canines. Keeping with that then, if the canines and the P3s align Sahelanthropus with the hominins, then that really colors the rest of the anatomy as well, doesn't it? Because we have a pretty clear expectation for what we should expect from the very first hominins after our split with chimpanzees. They should look almost exactly like every other Miocene ape on the block, with just a handful, just a smattering of hominin characteristics. Intuitively, I think we can all agree that it's probably faster to reduce your canine size to lose the CP3 honing complex and to lose the dimorphism that it is to get every single characteristic needed to be even a habitual biped. Meaning, I don't think it's an unfair expectation to say that if small canines in part define hominins, small canines would probably show up before bipedalism even in a habitual sense. That means that the hominin that we're looking for as one of the oldest hominins should theoretically look a lot like Sahelanthropus. Now, when I look at Sahelanthropus chidensis' anatomy with regard to bipedalism, this is what I see. I see an ape that is more orthograde or upright in the trees than like a chimp or a gorilla would be, which means that when this thing is coming down to the ground, it's probably going to walk upright. How much time it's spent on the ground is a completely different story because there is precedent for orthograde apes that spend most of their time in the trees, but when they come to the ground, they walk bipedally. Yet again, it's gibbons. Their arms are too long for them to walk in any other efficient way when they come to the ground. So on the rare occasion that they find themselves terrestrial, they walk on two legs like we do. Well, not like we do, but they walk on two legs. I have no way of knowing how much time Sahelanthropus chidensis or toumai actually spent on the ground versus in the trees, but what I do know is this. It's easier for an orthograde ape in the trees to become an orthograde biped on the ground than it is for a pronograde ape in the trees to become an orthograde ape on the ground. And because of that, parsimony-wise, I think it makes more sense that the last common ancestor of humans and chimps was probably upright in the trees, and then when the trees went away, it was also upright on the ground. That seems like a just so sorry for Sahelanthropus, but then those canines, right? That's what I think links it to the hominins and casts a very different light on the rest of its anatomy. Or maybe the loss of the CP3 honing complex and a reduction of the canines overall has happened more than once. Maybe it doesn't truly define hominins, maybe it's happened elsewhere in the Miocene amongst apes who, given their smaller canines and smaller, less impressive CP3 honing complexes in comparison to Cercopithecoids, might lose them more easily. I don't know the answer to that question, although I'm trying to figure it out. All I know is based off of the literature that's been presented on Sahelanthropus chidensis canines, it strikes a hominin bell for me. I guess to sum it up, for me, being a hominin isn't associated with bipedalism first, it's associated with canines first. And so that's what I think we need to be looking at. Give me the canines, Franck Guy, I'll figure this out. So what do you think about Sahelanthropus chidensis? What do you think about it with regard to its cursed status? What do you think about it with regard to its hominin status? How do you think it moved? I'd like to hear your opinion. In addition to that, if you like what I do here on this channel, please consider supporting me in the free way. That's liking, commenting, and subscribing. And ringing the bell. That helps me in the free way because it makes YouTube suggest my videos to other people who might be interested in this kind of thing. And if you want to help me out in a more financial way, you can join my Patreon. Patrons, it's feast or famine over there, right? They either get a ton of videos early access, one after the other, or they get nothing for months. But they always get their names at the end of every video, unless it's a weird video. But those are the exceptions. Anyways, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my gentle and of course very modern heart for being such a curious primate, and I'll see you real soon next time.